So this has really been an exciting day, and we are excited to talk with you. I was thinking when Chris was speaking a second ago and the previous panel, we could probably interchange any of the pieces of this panel and that last panel and Chris here and have a pretty substantive conversation, because the idea of storytelling with data and the process of going through it they all intersect. I'm Zach Markovics. I'm the Director of City Progress at What Works Cities. And What Works Cities is an initiative funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies that helps cities across the United States better leverage and use data to drive decision-making in their communities, ultimately to improve the lives of residents. And we launched in 2015 and have worked with well over 150 cities around the country to do just that, use data more effectively. As we've been doing this work, and I loved Chris's comment a second ago about how the unsexy work that it was required to make the really important stuff happen. As we've been going around the country and doing this work of building capacity in cities to make the use of data sustainable, one thing that we have learned is that you can't just do the process of putting together the infrastructure of using data without talking about it, without telling the story. In fact, what we have seen is that that if you do one without the other, the actual implementation of it is unsustainable. Cities that talk about this work internally to their staff and externally to their residents are the ones that actually build out the systems more and more. And you can see the sustained work happen across not only individual years, but administrations going forward. So I am really excited to turn to the three esteemed colleagues to my left to talk more about this work. I'm going to ask you all to sort of introduce yourself a little bit more as you go through it. But we heard earlier today a lot about kind of the process of using data in institutions. And I would love to know, maybe from each of you first, and then I'll go to individual, I'll start peppering you with questions. Tell a little bit about what you do, how you use data, and then a time in which telling a story using data has helped you to kind of release a logjam or help to see success in a story in the implementation side. Let me start with you, Mark.
Sure. So thanks. And I'm Markovics. I chair the Department of Population Health at NYU Langone. I'm a general internist. I'm a doc who's sort of been interested in public health and the interface between healthcare and community health for many years. And my sort of getting into this business has really led to, or really it come from this sense that you can't manage, whether it's a community program, an academic program, or a city, what you can't measure. And so that's been a theme throughout the work that I've done as a clinician, as a scientist, and as an administrator. And it's really now bringing that into the city and broader spectrum that's come to the fore in terms of a key example where data has made the difference. We used to, this is separate from the work I'm going to talk about simply, but I think it helped crystallize it for me, was doing grant-funded work in methadone treatment programs where we used to bring primary care directly to patients in an integrated fashion, and there were rules at the time that made it very difficult to bill for that, and therefore it was not sustainable. And it was really in making a data-driven argument on healthcare savings to the state that we were able to sort of change that around, get billing for it, and it's become a sustainable model that's then scaled very broadly. So that, I think, lit the bug for me, and it's been straight ahead ever since.
It's really interesting. Eric?
Sure. Hi, my name is Aaron Foley. I am the chief storyteller at the city of Detroit. I feel like I'm the only one in the room not from New York. And I might be one of the few people in the room who doesn't have a data background. I have a journalism background, and I worked in local journalism back home in Detroit for about a decade, and I joined our city government's Department of Media Services. So in other city governments, it's your department that is the videographers, the audiovisual tech, the people that do city cable, public access channels, so on and so forth. I was added to the team as a storyteller, first of its kind in city government. And basically, my day-to-day is managing a website where I have a team of writers, a photographer, and 2 other videographers, and we produce content akin to a news site. We go out across Detroit's 200 plus neighborhoods, talk to residents, talk to small business owners, talk to minority communities, religious communities, and really try to paint a picture of what Detroit looks like. And we do it online, on our cable channel, on our social media, our Spotify playlists, whatever we can think of. So how we've used data, though, is the website that I manage. When you go on the website, it looks like a curved or a box or something like that. It has the main article and the older stuff to the side. But there is a neighborhood map of the city of Detroit, and there are 209, I think, at our last count, different neighborhoods. And if you click on each neighborhood, you find out data about the neighborhood. And it's the first time the city had put in this form. So you can see number of demolitions going on in the neighborhood, number of parks going on in the neighborhood, number of permits pulled if you're renovating your house, whatever. And what we were seeing was in certain neighborhoods, there was a correlation between number of homes being knocked down, because that's a big issue in Detroit. There's a lot of vacancy and abandonment. We saw a correlation between number of homes being knocked down and number of people who still lived in the neighborhood pulling permits to get repairs done on their house. So that was telling us that there was a lot of activity going on in that particular neighborhood, and people were feeling confident about living there. So we started writing more stories about those particular areas, talking to residents over there, talking to the businesses over there, and just asking them, what it's like to live in the neighborhood. And the goal of that was to encourage people who were on the bubble about either staying in Detroit or actually moving into the city from somewhere else to kind of think twice about some of these neighborhoods that we're seeing all this activity. And it's only been going on for about 2 years, but it's starting to work. We're starting to see more residents choose those neighborhoods where you're seeing the houses knocked down and we're seeing the residents start to make improvements, and that's a net positive for the city of Detroit, because our narrative is such that we lost a lot of population, so we're trying to add as much population to make up for that.
Thank you.
So Craig Campbell, Assistant Director for Policy and Operations at the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. We are a relatively new team in government, at least in government timescales, about 5 years old. Our mandate is threefold. We do advanced analytics as a shared service for different city agencies. We manage the city's open data program, and we have a broad data stewardship mandate. So as far as storytelling goes, we both tell stories with data and also tell stories about data. And I'll give a quick example on each side. For our analytics practice, our team of data scientists will partner with an agency, scope a problem, identify relevant data sets, and build a model. What we are optimizing for in that process is not necessarily the precision of the statistical model so much as its usability in the field. And so it's very important that as part of the process of developing analytic tools, we are also engaging the frontline staff that will ultimately be using them, understanding their user stories, and then being able to articulate how a solution that we're developing is actually going to move the needle for them. On the open data side, the vision for open data in New York City is open data for all. The idea that all New Yorkers can benefit from open data. Part of that program is expanding awareness of public data resources, the 2,500 data sets in the city's open data portal. In March, we held the third annual Open Data Week, which had about 50 different events across 5 boroughs, brought 3,500 people out, really with the goal to teach people, put color to the tables that you see on the online portal, bring them to life through stories of how the data was collected, how different community boards are organizing, using this information, tools that city agencies are developing based on, that's my contact, based on the information. And that proved a very, in its third year, powerful forum for articulating the myriad uses of public data, both in city government and outside of it.
That's great, and I'm going to come right back this way. And just so you know, we're going to, with about 4 minutes left, we're going to open up to questions, so you can start to get that ready now. We're not going to go over this time. So I'm going to go right back to you, Craig. Those are some really, the way you guys break it down in Moda is really interesting. And as a part of what Work Cities, as I mentioned before, like we have seen that the public talking about, even in process, the use of data is important from an external lens. So Aaron, I'm going to cue that up for you in a second. But for you, I imagine that a lot of the work that your office is doing is, as you're talking to departments, there's an internal storytelling piece, right? It's not just, you can't just throw data out there, right? This is a conversation, as we talked about earlier in the previous panel, of breaking down silos across these that are really entrenched. And I imagine part of your job is to tell people in departments, like, why is this important? Why should we be collaborating across? Can you talk more about your role in doing that? And I mean, this is an audience of practitioners and individuals. Like, let's get in the weeds a little bit here and talk about like what it is that you are required to do to be a storyteller to departments.
Absolutely. That is part of my day-to-day. I will say that it's more empowering the people in the department, some of who are in the audience, looking at Cindy from the Department of Buildings, who are doing this work already to give them our set of tools, our perch within City Hall to tell those stories. A major change that we made a couple of years ago with open data was in the annual reporting process. Historically, it had been agencies disclosing what data assets they had, when they would make them public, and data that they had made public in the previous year. For the past few years, we have added a storytelling layer on top of that, where we have gone out with agencies, with the community groups that we have other touch points with, to identify stories of people in communities, companies, researchers who are using the data that city agencies are creating. And I think that this feedback loop doesn't always necessarily exist between the agency itself that is publishing the data, and so it becomes a powerful tactic from our perspective to be able to state, you are required to publish this information because it's public data legislation, but this is how we animate the real value. It's telling the story of Mary Tobin, who's the director of Brownsville Community Solutions, who uses probation data and crime statistics to understand joblessness, or the researchers at Columbia's Earth Institute, who are using tree census data to understand saturation rates for stormwater runoff. And by assembling sort of a catalog of these stories, we begin to make the case for why publishing data is valuable beyond ticking a compliance box for government transparency.
Right. The hammer doesn't always work in these situations, right? Sort of telling that helps to put a picture around it. Aaron, as you're going to, I mean, there's no template for chief storyteller, right? I mean, you are the first, I think, in city government around the country.
I always put an asterisk next to it because every time I go and speak, I don't want someone to jump out from the audience and say, well, actually. But it's been 2 years now, and nobody said anything, so okay. Yes, I think it's safe to say.
Well, you can jump at me. I'm saying the first. I don't know if that's true, so you don't have to attack him. That's really hard. You gave a really nice overview of what you do and how you do that. Underlying all that is very similar to what I mentioned to Craig. Requires a lot of work, I would imagine, as talking to departments about why are you doing this and why is it important to tell that story? As the same sort of thing that I had mentioned to Craig, what does it require you to do internally in the city in order to reflect publicly the kinds of stories that you're trying to tell about the city of Detroit?
Right. So our culture internally at city government is we're only just now starting to think about numbers and statistics and data. We've had a lot of catching up to do. This was a city that literally went bankrupt, 6 years ago. And before that, it was a very ingrained culture of business as usual, I guess. We're only just now reaching a point where I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, we hired a data scientist to work in our workforce development department recently. We've hired a digital and inclusionary advocate in our IT department. Only just now are some of these departments beginning to actually crunch numbers and look at, we have an IT team funded by Bloomberg now that just started. We're looking at, okay, how do you look at numbers and translate that to, the human condition, I guess. One example is that one ongoing issue in Detroit is that we have open borders when it comes to schools. So if you live in the city of Detroit, you can send your kid to a suburban school district or anywhere outside of Detroit. And so we looked at numbers in which we said, okay, where's the highest concentration of kids leaving the city? And we honed in on a cluster of neighborhoods on the west side of the city, and we came up with a bus loop that people use a public school bus. And it picks up the kids from around those clusters of neighborhoods, and it keeps them in the city by keeping the bus loop around schools within the city so their parents aren't driving over the border into a suburban school district. That's one way that we've used data to sort of solve an ongoing issue in the city. But getting people to think twice about it is only just now coming to fruition. People tend to see numbers and spreadsheets and things like that, and they get intimidated by it. But finally, we're hiring some smarter people to say, like, okay, there are people behind these numbers. We'll take care of the people. We'll take care of the numbers part of it. Now we can dispatch someone else to deal with the human part of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's super. And just as a quick follow-up, how, when you stepped into this role, what were the kinds of issues that you were facing? To talk in terms, like how was that received by other departments who maybe had been here for a long period of time, staff that are trying to say, now you're asking for all this other piece of information, let me just do my job and stay in my corner?
Well, I mean, this Detroit, not the city government, but Detroit itself has always had sort of this negative image, right? And when I came in, one of my directives was to tell people, like, hey, we can own our own story. We are born and raised Detroiters. We know the city like any other. What assets do you have in your department? What resources do you have in your department that show what your department is doing that benefits Detroiters, or what you're seeing on the ground that after something your department has done, things have changed. So we have a wide-scale demolition program going on in Detroit right now, and we have a real super numbers guy that I work with. I love. We're texting all the time. But one thing that we're working on is showing, there are a couple of streets or a couple of blocks in Detroit where there has been like one or two houses that were blighted, and the rest of the neighborhood is pristine. And these one or two blighted houses have just been sitting there empty for like 10, 15 years, and people have been begging the city to knock it down, and finally the city knocks it down. Well, that'll be my job to go into the neighborhood and talk to those residents and say, like, hey, how are you feeling now? Are you feeling more confident about living here? Are you feeling more, positive about living in the city? So we're I've got this guy, Brian, compiling all of those different blocks where he's got greens and reds and stuff like that. In certain blocks where there's a red and it's crossed out and everything else is green, then I'll go or I'll send somebody on my team to go knock on the doors, or we'll go to the block club meeting or something like that. All of this, for our directives as the city, is to improve perception of the city of Detroit. Nationwide, internationally, we've got a negative perception, but closer to home, internally, people are always on the bubble about whether they want to stay in Detroit, whether they want to pursue their future in Detroit. What are we doing internally at the city government level to project externally that, like, hey, we're trying to make life better for you, therefore we need you to stay here in the city.
Yeah. Mark, did not mean to leave you out of this conversation, but I think it's helpful to start with the city because actually you are sitting kind of outside of the government, but at the same time are bringing together data from lots of different pieces and in some ways trying to paint a picture of what this looks like in the city. I have sort of two questions. One's about what you do, but let me actually start with something about sort of how you tell the story to people like Craig and Aaron. Right? How do you talk to city governments about the work that you do? And maybe the second question has to do with, I would love you to talk a little bit more about dashboarding as a tool. It's something I know that you've spent a lot of time on, is using that as a storytelling device. And I think those two questions maybe intersect a little bit.
Sure, totally, thanks. So what we do is we have developed a resource, the City Health Dashboard, that I'll say a word about, that integrates not only health data, but data about what really produces health. Because when you ask what really produces health, healthcare contributes to health, but of course other things too, as you well know, safe housing, good education, economic security. And when we talked in a story-like fashion to mayors and city managers around the country, and this was work done with the National Resource Network, we really saw that there was a glaring lack of data about health at a granular fashion at the city level. It was a lot of information that existed at the county or state level, but if you were less so in New York City, which is very data rich, but if you're in a smaller mid-sized city in much of the rest of the country, you basically had no specific data about health and the drivers of health in a single place that was reliable. And people were telling us basically that when we asked, well, so where's health on your sort of priority list as a community leader or as a municipal leader? And the answer was it kind of isn't so much because we don't have the traction that we need on the data side. Or it's high, but we don't know really how to address it. So that's really the context, and it's really from a perspective of health having multiple drivers. The other piece of the narrative is that not everybody's interested in health or in education, but if you bring these drivers together in a single place, it allows you to take a kind of holistic approach to economic and community development and municipal change that I think is very powerful. So that's sort of the context. The more specifics is really that we tried to develop this resource, and it's now been live for about a year for the 500 biggest cities in the US, which is really all cities in the US down to about 65,000. And the stories that we're getting from many places is really that of fundamentally of sort of kind of turning the lights on. People really just didn't have, in a visual fashion, access to data that is granular about their neighborhoods and communities, and it is beginning to spark change. And so we're working with a number of other, we're sitting at in an academic institution. We're working with groups like the National League of Cities and the International City County Managers Association and the National Resource Network and others as sort of bridges with cities and communities to kind of get the word out and get this resource really, which is a change-making tool, into the hands of them as needs it.
Why do you think that is it's turning the lights on? Like, what is it that you're showing that all of a sudden wasn't there before?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group in Waco, Texas, Prosper Waco, which is a local community impact organization. And essentially, they were trying to conduct a community needs assessment and thinking that community health workers would be valuable, but they didn't really have any way of tailoring to the needs of specific communities in terms of where were the rates of teen pregnancy really high, or where were rates of school absenteeism really needing targeting. And so to sort of be presented with those kinds of measures at a census block level, census tract level for your neighborhood or community is just can be revelatory. Those are the language that we're hearing back.
That's interesting. And I mean, so you have your dashboard. There's the work that like Raj Chetty has done with the Opportunity Insights
Totally.
on a different level, where you're seeing this intersection of data at a census tract level,
Yes.
really intersecting and telling a story about what it is in a city that is coming kind of from outside the city. And I mean, how you can talk to me, you can talk directly to them or to the audience. Like, what is it that cities need to do to better incorporate that into the decision making that they're doing, and maybe even tell a story about their population to their residents?
Well, it actually gets back, I think, to some of the conversation earlier about, and here too, of bridging across the city departments, across silos, across areas of responsibility. Some of the most effective use that we've seen has been when sort of a local champion in a city or community with the community organization has gathered people from sort of diverse, with diverse portfolios, if you will, and looked at the data in totality, because then you're sort of looking, well, maybe transportation is all right here, but it's really a housing issue, and you basically get people talking. It's really a resource to get people to talking to each other also about common roots to shared problems.
It's super interesting, and I'm going to open it up after this next question I asked for you all. So, get excited. But I want to ask you all sort of one question on this. I mentioned before, we, as What Works Cities, we have this certification initiative that helps to measure how well cities are doing in using data effectively. And one core part of that is about communicating, both externally and then internally to staff. Like, how do you set the organizational expectation that managing and delivering on data is most important? It's a key criteria as a part of what we measure. But we see huge barriers to that. And I would love maybe each of you to talk a little about the barriers that you're seeing in leveraging data to tell stories, either individually, like what are you facing as you're trying to paint a narrative or convince departments and actually deliver on these services, or convince governments to sort of do this work. What are the biggest barriers you're facing in this work? I'll start now with you, Craig, since it's been a little while since we got you.
I think a challenge is that data, by definition, is abstract.
Yeah.
And so it makes having a conversation about data that is grounded in a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding particularly challenging. I think that the way to confront that is precisely with storytelling. It is moving from abstract, high-level discussions of data and IT strategy into these very specific qualitative, anecdotal stories that pair with the actual data itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have an example of where that may have been effective with you all? I know I'm putting you on the spot on this. Sorry.
Sure. I would, thinking back to what Rodney was mentioning about the volume of taxi trip records, I think that in transportation, it's as close as we get to big data in city government. And those are data sets that taxi trip records with over the course of several years, billions of records. It becomes a very different story when you're able to say, this green cab picked someone up in the Crown Heights and drove them to the Lower East Side at this time with 4 passengers. But using that record that tells that specific story in aggregate over the course of years then creates this body of knowledge which you can then enact policy change on. And I think it's really important to tell that story of the row of the data as well as the data set as the whole in order to be convincing on making operational changes or developing policy change.
Thank you. Aaron, if you were to be briefing yourself when you started the job right now, what would be the barriers that you would be prepping yourself for?
Two big challenges we have at the city is, I'll try to be brief because I'll go all day on about this, but one issue that I first noticed when I first started at the city was me having a journalism background. I recognize a good story when I see it. Everybody else that does not have a journalism background does not recognize something that gold right in front of them. So when I hear people casually mention like, oh, I ran into the oldest lady who has owned her house on this block and she's had her house for 60 years. I'm like, oh, that is interesting. Nobody owns a house for that long and it has been the sole owner. We should go and talk to that person and I'll follow up. And they'll say like, oh, I forgot the address or I forgot what it was. So getting people to actually recognize in different departments what, I think people are so ingrained in the work that they're doing and sort of maybe overwhelmed sometimes that they don't recognize the good that they're doing or recognize the change that they're seeing. They're just like, oh, we fixed this and now it's fixed. But you're impacting someone's lives or you're seeing impact in someone's lives. So getting people to recognize that and getting people to think more like journalists in addition to their regular jobs, but of course asking someone working in government to do one more thing is always a challenge. And which leads me into my next point is that we do have a few very, very strong data-minded people working in our city government. And my wish is that we need more of them, and particularly some who can actually write. A lot of them are very good at crunching numbers and doing all of that part of it. But our challenge is that we have an open data portal too, and we'll just the people that run the open data portal in IT, they just throw it out there. Like here's this new data set, here's this, and no instructions on how to use it, no telling the public how to do this or whatever. What I need in across all departments is if every department hired a writer, or if every one department hired someone that can ably translate the numbers to text so that people can read what exactly is the benefit here, not just here's our, we just a few months ago started putting out our health department, restaurant scores. and everybody wants it to be like New York, where you see A, B in every window, but we have it on our open data portal. But again, we just threw it out there and didn't give anybody any guidance. What I needed was someone to write like, okay, here are the restaurants over here that are, have good scores. Here's why the restaurants over here are having bad scores, and here's exactly how it is, so that people can understand it, not just fishing through all of our tables and whatnot. So that's our thing.
So although you're got storytelling in your title, what I'm hearing is that everybody's a storyteller here, or we needed to get in that direction.
Yeah, everyone has a story to tell, but I don't think everybody realizes, either that they do have a story or how exactly to tell it.
Yeah.
And just
Mark,
to add on that,
please.
I think another skill set that journalists have that isn't necessarily standard in city government is knowing one's audience and writing for a specific audience and tailoring a message to different audiences. Like, we hear a lot about culture change and talk a lot about it and moving the needle toward more data-driven government. But culture change comes down to behavior change at scale. And to motivate behavior change, you need to understand the very specific, it's something that marketers are good at too, your different segments and personas, and sort of target the message differently depending on those, whether it's a analyst, a line level inspector, or an agency deputy commissioner.
That's great. In the next 45 seconds, what would you build on that in terms of a barrier that you're facing in this work for people to sort of see how they can overcome it?
Yeah, two jump to mind briefly. One is really community engagement, which is to say community-driven measures. And so, we kind of come up with data, and the question is what's actually most useful to people. In healthcare, there's a expression that's gaining traction, nothing about me without me. And it's really the same with data. And so engaging users in defining what are the data points that are the most valuable to people, how presented, how, I think is really, we don't do nearly enough of that. And the second piece I would point to is that on some important measures, there's a lack of data. That is, for example, we're thinking a lot about firearm safety, we're thinking about climate change, we're thinking about transportation. If you try to get uniform data on those measures that is up to date and granular for America's cities, it's not really there. And so that's a barrier, I think, to painting a more holistic set of priorities for many cities and communities.
Thank you so much. We have a time, I think, maybe for 2 questions in the audience. That's great. All right, well then I will ask one more and then we'll wrap it up for the day. I'm going to steal from my, the previous moderator, Mitch, is that if you were to give advice to somebody who's sort of coming into this role or sort of approaching this kind of work, what would that be? Someone who's either entering the field or somebody who's looking to try and figure out how they can get better at using data effectively to deliver a message, and that could be either internally or externally. We'll start with you, and then we can go down the line.
My advice would be to put yourself in an area that you really care about, and ask hard questions. I think, again, and it was said earlier, there's a tremendous amount of data, and the question is also of sort of interrogating it in the right way. What are the questions that really matter that can gain traction? So I think, follow your heart into an area about which you're passionate, and then look at it and ask what you want to ask from there.
Great, thank you.
So full disclosure, I'm actually leaving my role in 3 minutes. Well, I'm leaving to take a fellowship so I can use the time during the fellowship to model my role, because I had to make it up as I go along, and I just needed time to actually figure out exactly what I should be doing, because it's been a lot of playing it by ear. So for someone coming into my role, that I had to figure out on my own. Patience is probably the number one thing. Coming from outside of government, I was not used to bureaucracy. Dealing with patience has been a big thing for me these last 2 years that I've been in city government. But fortunately, that mindset seems to be changing. We seem to be a little bit more quicker of doing things because we have a lot of mandates that we need to figure out in a very short amount of time. So,
Thank you.
I think there's a tendency in government to want to say everything that we have done as a storytelling mechanism, to be very exhaustive about we did this, 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 and this, which doesn't make for very good stories, actually. And so my piece of advice would be know your goal in communicating and know your audience, and take care to actually study or talk to the audience that you're trying to influence or affect.
I hope you will join. Oh, we have one question in the back.
Yeah, the question is kind of for Aaron, but for any of you. So you have an amazing title. I think Chief Storyteller is amazing just for a city to invest in that kind of role. What do you think it takes for city or county governments to decide, we want to invest in this and we want to tell our story and we want to use data to do that? And how can other cities also do that?
that was the proposal I submitted to the fellowship that I'm studying. So I will answer that question next year. But
this time next year, he will come back onto the stage and tell you exactly how it's done.
But I would just say really quickly, the way you tell someone to invest in this is a chance for a city or county to own their story. For too long in Detroit, other people were telling Detroit's story, people from outside of Detroit or people not getting Detroit's story right inside the city. Like I said before, the people that work in city government know the city inside and out, not just because we work in public service, but we also 9 times out of 10 are actually from the city. So we have a personal connection as well as a professional one. So if, again, getting back to, okay, who do you want to benefit? It's the people in your service area that can benefit from the most from this, but putting people in the spotlight through data is how we're doing this. So.
And I will just say that when working with cities across the country, in What Works Cities, we have seen that it is the unlikely storytellers that once you provide them and give them to sort of the thing that Aaron mentioned before, give them the opportunity to talk about their work from a fundamental way and realize that there's actually sort of a key outcomes and impact that they are delivering every day, you can see start to proliferate and happen even more and build the case for why storytellers are most important coming from all corners of the government. I want to thank you all for listening and for the panel for coming on board today and for Route 50 for hosting us this afternoon. So thank you.